Washington, D.C., on a bitterly cold winter day. Snow blanketed the long streets, casting a somber and heavy atmosphere over the city. Inside the headquarters of the United States Secret Service, the tension was palpable. Agents were busy monitoring security feeds, the glow of flickering screens illuminating their focused faces. The sound of rapid keyboard strokes filled the air, punctuated by urgent phone calls being relayed. And then, the heavy steel doors suddenly swung open. No prior announcement, no alarms, no security detail leading the way as usual. Only a familiar silhouette strode inside, the echo of polished leather shoes striking against the marble floor resonating through the room's eerie silence. The entire room froze. Every agent stopped in their tracks. Papers halted midair, fingers hovered above keyboards, and every pair of eyes turned, wide with astonishment, toward the man who had just walked in. Donald Trump. He stood there, saying nothing at first. His sharp gaze swept across the room, scanning every face as if searching for something or someone. And then, in a voice both steady and commanding, he spoke. "I'm looking for someone." The agents exchanged glances, confusion flashing in their eyes. No one knew what was happening. But at that moment, one thing became clear. His arrival was not a coincidence, and whatever was about to unfold could change everything. No one in the room dared to move. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. The agents' breathing grew heavy, their hands frozen mid-motion, pens hovered above paper, fingers suspended over keyboards. The once busy hum of the command center had fallen into absolute silence. All eyes were locked onto the man who had just walked in. A former president, a symbol of power. And yet today, he stood alone. Donald Trump. His stance was unwavering, but the usual bravado that accompanied his political speeches was absent. This time, he was not here to make a statement, nor to argue, nor to reclaim authority. He was here for something far more significant. He scanned the room, his gaze sharp, precise, missing nothing. The younger agents exchanged uncertain glances, still trying to comprehend the gravity of the situation. But the veterans reacted differently. Some instinctively straightened their posture. Others narrowed their eyes, as if recognizing the weight of the moment before them. Then Trump spoke. His voice was low but resonant, a command rather than a request. "I'm looking for someone." No one answered. The silence was deafening. "An agent saved my life years ago, but his name has been erased from every record." As soon as the words left his lips, the air in the room thickened. The younger agents blinked in confusion, but the seasoned ones immediately grasped the implications. In the world of intelligence and national security, when a name is wiped from the system, there are only two possibilities. Either that person never existed, or someone with immense power ensured that the world forgot them. But how could an agent, someone skilled enough to save a man like Trump, disappear without leaving even the faintest trace? Trump clenched his fists, his gaze unwavering. "I will not leave here until I find the truth." The room felt frozen in time. Jonathan Reyes, director of the United States Secret Service, stood at the far end of the room. He had been observing the entire exchange in silence, his face an unreadable mask. But those who knew him well noticed the subtle tapping of his fingers against the desk, a small, unconscious habit that only surfaced when his mind was racing. Reyes finally took a step forward, his eyes locking onto Trump's. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, Reyes broke the silence. His voice was calm, but razor-sharp. "You're telling me that an agent saved your life," he said slowly, "but there's no record of him?" Trump nodded. "Not a single file, not a single report, not even a mention, but I know it happened." Reyes said nothing for a long moment. He knew Trump was not a man prone to fantasies or false memories. If he was standing here making this claim, there had to be a reason. And yet, in all his years leading the agency, he had never heard of such a case. Every agent has a record. Every mission is documented. No one is a ghost in this system. Unless... Beside Reyes, a young agent quietly opened his laptop. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard as he initiated a deep-dive search through the agency's vast personnel database. Minutes passed. The agent's frown deepened. He hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether he should say it aloud. "There's nothing." His voice was barely above a whisper. No match to that description. If he ever existed, someone went to great lengths to erase him completely. Trump's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly. He had anticipated this answer, but hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the disbelief in the agent's voice, only strengthened his resolve. Reyes let out a slow breath. Perhaps there was a miscommunication. No. Trump cut him off. His voice carried an unmistakable finality. I remember every detail. That night, I was ambushed. I was seconds from death, and if it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here today. But the next morning when I tried to find him, nothing. It was as if he had never existed. A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the older agents exchanged wary glances. Those who had been in the agency long enough knew this was no simple case of a lost file. Trump turned back to Reyes. He had a name. I don't know his real name, but I know the code name he used. Reyes remained silent. Trump took a slow breath, then spoke with absolute clarity. Shadow 1. This time, the silence was not just from shock, but from fear. A veteran agent at the back of the room unconsciously clenched his fists. Another stole a glance at Reyes, waiting for his reaction. Reyes didn't move. But something flickered in his eyes. He knew that name. Trump took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly, yet every syllable carried weight. I want to know why a man like that was erased from history. A suffocating silence filled the room. The agents knew that if Trump continued down this path, he wouldn't just uncover a long-lost name. He might unearth secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. Was he searching for a forgotten hero? Or about to awaken a truth far more dangerous than he could ever imagine? Jonathan Reyes, director of the Secret Service, took a deep breath, steadying his voice to maintain its calm tone. But his eyes betrayed something else, a tension that even he could not suppress. You're telling me that an agent saved your life, but there's no record of him anywhere? Trump nodded, his expression unwavering. He was erased from history. But I remember everything. Every detail. It was 1982. I was a young businessman. Ambitious, driven, but also surrounded by enemies. Reyes crossed his arms, his sharp gaze locked onto Trump. I need more details. Trump's eyes swept across the room, taking in every expression before he finally spoke again. His voice was low, deliberate. That night, I had just left an important meeting in New York. A multi-million-dollar deal had just been signed. I didn't know it then, but I had stepped onto the wrong playing field. I had unknowingly walked into territory controlled by people who do not forgive mistakes. And as I drove home, I realized I was being followed. The room remained silent. Every agent present understood what it meant to be hunted. Trump continued, his voice dipping into a grave tone, as if he were reliving the moment in real time. I turned into a quiet alley. It should have been empty. But before I could react, an SUV cut me off, blocking the road ahead. Some of the agents unconsciously shifted in their seats, a reflex, a trained response to high-risk situations, even when only hearing about them. 4 men stepped out, each one armed. They moved fast, professional, no hesitation. Trump clenched his fists. I still remember the face of the one in charge. He bent down, pressing the cold barrel of a gun against my temple. And then, the words that had haunted him for 4 decades. You think you can walk into our world without paying the price? Trump let the sentence linger in the air, letting its weight settle over the room. That was the moment I knew I was going to die. His voice was measured, devoid of theatrics. I had no weapon, no bodyguards, no one coming to help me, just me and 4 guns aimed directly at my head. Reyes's expression darkened. And then what happened? Trump's eyes sharpened. A voice came from the shadows. A stillness spread across the room. Even the most hardened agents leaned in ever so slightly, drawn in by the gravity of what was coming. Drop your weapons. If you don't, you won't get a second warning. Silence. Some of the older agents exchanged glances. That phrase, they had heard it before, somewhere. Trump pressed on. They laughed. One of them even lifted his gun, aiming towards the darkness, ready to fire. But before he could pull the trigger, bang! Trump raised a single finger, marking the exact moment that had changed his fate. A single gunshot, one precise shot, the bullet tore through his hand, forcing him to drop his weapon. A few agents nodded subtly, already piecing together the kind of skill required to make that kind of shot. And before anyone could react, a figure emerged from the shadows. moving so fast that all I saw was a blur. A man, dressed in black. No badge, no insignia, no identifying marks. But he fought like a phantom. Trump's jaw tensed. He didn't fire again. He didn't need to. With nothing but his fists and a single knife, he took them down, one by one. A young agent, barely out of training, couldn't stop himself from whispering, "Alone?" Trump nodded. Alone. He moved like a ghost. Before they even understood what was happening, they were already on the ground, some alive, some not. Reyes exhaled slowly. "And did you speak to him?" Trump held his gaze. There was no time for questions. I was still catching my breath when he grabbed my arm and pulled me forward, signaling me to run. I remember it clearly. His left hand was injured, blood dripping from his fingers. But he didn't slow down. We ran through alleys, weaving through the city, until I was finally safe. Trump paused. His breathing, though steady, carried a weight that every man in the room could feel. He didn't say much, but just before he vanished into the night, he turned back and looked at me. Trump inhaled deeply, before repeating the last words that had echoed in his mind for the past 40 years. "Don't let them win." The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Somewhere behind him, an agent muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ." Trump turned back to Reyes, his voice steady. The next morning, I tried to find him. I contacted the police, the Secret Service, anyone who might have records of what happened that night. But there was nothing. No reports, no mentions of a gunfight, no witnesses. It was as if the whole thing had never happened, as if he never existed. Reyes folded his arms, and that's when he started to suspect. Trump nodded. Every trace of him was gone, but I know what I saw. I know he was real, and now I want the truth. He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Reyes's. "So tell me, what do you know about him?" Reyes didn't move. His face remained neutral, but the agents around him noticed something. His jaw had tightened ever so slightly. His silence was an answer in itself. "I've been in this agency for over 20 years, Reyes finally said, his voice slower this time. "And in all those years I have only ever heard one name." Trump narrowed his eyes. Reyes met his gaze directly. Shadow One. And this time the room didn't just tense. It suffocated. It was as if the very air had been drained from the space, as if everyone present had stopped breathing, waiting for the inevitable fallout of what had just been said. An older agent, standing near the far end of the room, finally broke the silence. His voice was rough, carrying the weight of decades in the field. "If you're really looking for him, then you're walking into something far more dangerous than you realize, sir." Trump stared at Reyes, his eyes filled with both doubt and unshakable determination. "I tried to find him," Trump repeated, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades of searching for a name that had vanished. But there was no record, nothing, as if he never existed. A young agent, seated toward the back of the room, was frantically typing, pulling every available record from the deepest, most classified databases. Lines of encrypted code flashed across the screen, filtering through archives buried beneath layers of national security protocols. Minutes passed. The agent's face paled. "There's nothing," the young man murmured, almost to himself. "No name, no file. If he existed, someone erased every trace of him." The room fell silent, except for the faint hum of the computer system still running its futile search. Reyes clenched his fists. His voice, usually even and composed, dropped an octave. "Shadow One." Every senior agent in the room exchanged looks. Some averted their eyes. Others turned to Reyes with a mix of unease and silent acknowledgement. No one spoke. Trump observed them carefully. That name meant something to them. Reyes exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. His voice was cautious, deliberate. "I've only heard that name once in my entire career. No records, no mission reports. But there's one thing I do know." He held Trump's gaze. If Shadow One was real, he wasn't just an agent. 3 days later, Trump and Reyes stood at the edge of a dense forest in rural Virginia. The trees loomed over them like silent sentinels, their bare branches creaking against the wind. Before them sat an old wooden cabin, its walls weathered and gray, blending into the landscape like it had been forgotten by time itself. To an untrained eye, it looked abandoned. But Reyes knew better. The windows had been reinforced. The chimney showed no smoke, yet there were subtle signs of an underground heating system, and most telling of all, there was no visible path leading to the house. No driveway, no mailbox, no signs of recent visitors. Whoever lived here had gone to great lengths to disappear. Reyes instinctively rested a hand on his holstered firearm. "Are we sure about this?" Trump didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, raising a fist, and knocked firmly 3 times against the rough wooden door. Silence. He knocked again. Still no response, but Trump could feel it. Someone was watching. Then a voice rasped from inside, low, hoarse, and edged with steel. "Go away, I have nothing to say." Trump didn't move. He took a steady breath before speaking. "David Cole, I've been looking for you for 40 years. Silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then, the faint click of a lock disengaging. The door creaked open just enough to reveal a shadowed figure standing in the dim light. His hair had turned white with age, but his frame was still strong, his posture rigid. His face bore the lines of time, of battles fought long ago. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They were sharp, calculating. Not the eyes of a man who had retired, but of one who had never stopped being ready for war. Shadow 1. David Cole. He looked from Trump to Reyes, his expression unreadable. "If you're here," he said at last, his voice low and gravelly, "then you truly want the truth," he exhaled. "But understand this, some secrets are not meant to be unearthed." Trump didn't blink. "I don't care how dangerous this is, I want to know." Cole studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, motioning them in. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit, sparse, functional. No photographs, no signs of a life lived, just a single wooden table in the center of the room, with a single metal box resting on top. Cole walked over to it, placing his hand on the lid. His fingers hovered for a moment before he finally opened it. "This is all I have left." Trump and Reyes leaned in. Inside the box were aged photographs, yellow documents stamped with bold red ink, and a set of old reel-to-reel audio tapes. Each file was emblazoned with a warning in thick letters, classified, not for release. Reyes picked up a thick folder, flipping it open. His brow furrowed as he scanned the words on the first page. List of operations erased from U.S. history. A single photograph slipped free, fluttering onto the table. Trump reached for it. It showed a group of agents, all dressed in black tactical gear, standing together in the depths of a dark forest. But one man stood slightly apart from the rest, his sharp gaze not focused on the camera but on something beyond its frame, as if anticipating a threat that no one else saw. Beneath the image, barely legible after decades, was a faded caption. "David Cole, Shadow 1, the man erased from history." Trump clenched the photograph in his hand, his voice dropping into a whisper. "So you were real." Cole's eyes, old yet piercing, never left Trump's. "I was." He paused. "But what you need to understand is far bigger than me." He pushed the metal box toward them. "If you open this, you won't just be looking for me anymore. You'll be exposing people who don't want to be found. I've spent 40 years in the shadows because I knew too much. And if you go down this road—" He let his words hang in the air. "There will be no turning back." Trump didn't flinch. His resolve was absolute. "I've waited 40 years. I won't stop now." Reyes flipped through the documents, his face growing graver with every page. Then, in a hushed, almost disbelieving tone, he muttered, "If this is real, this could shake the foundations of America." Cold winds swept through the streets of Washington, D.C., but the atmosphere inside the Secret Service headquarters was even colder. Deep within the main building, in a dimly lit conference room, the air was thick with tension. The flickering fluorescent lights cast long shadows over the table, where old, dust-covered files lay stacked, documents that, if revealed, could shake an entire government to its core. Across the table, Trump and Reyes sat in silence. Reyes tapped his fingers against the wooden surface, a slow, measured rhythm, before finally speaking. "If we release these documents, do you understand what will happen?" Trump clenched his fists. "I've waited 40 years for the truth. I will not let it be buried again." Reyes let out a slow exhale, his expression heavy with the weight of what was at stake. "This isn't just about one man or a forgotten agent. The names in these files, they're not just unknown politicians. These are people who hold real power. If you go through with this, no one can guarantee your safety." Trump leaned back slightly, locking eyes with Reyes. "I've never cared about my own safety. The only thing I care about is justice." Reyes held his gaze for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Hundreds of camera lenses focused intently on the podium outside the United States Secret Service headquarters. Reporters from CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, and every major media outlet were present. The air was electric with anticipation. Then Trump stepped forward. Unlike his past public appearances, where he was either rallying crowds or standing at the center of controversy, today there was something different about him. Today, he was not a politician. He was not a symbol of division. Today, he was simply a man standing for justice. His voice, deep and unwavering, carried across the hushed crowd. "Today, I stand here to tell the story of a man who should have never been forgotten. A man who sacrificed everything in the pursuit of justice, only to be erased from history. But today, I will bring his name back." The audience murmured. Some reporters furiously scribbled notes, others exchanged glances, realizing that something significant was about to happen. And then, from the right side of the stage, a man stepped forward, David Cole. He wore a simple black suit, nothing flashy, nothing meant to draw attention. And yet, he didn't need it. His presence alone commanded the crowd's respect. His movements were steady, his posture strong, but his eyes still burned with the intensity of a man who had lived in the shadows for too long. For the first time in 40 years, a ghost of the past had returned to the light. A few older agents in the crowd stiffened when they saw him, their bodies reacting instinctively. Some stood straighter, as if in silent salute, acknowledging the presence of a man who had once been a legend. David Cole scanned the audience before reaching for the microphone. "I am not an important man," he began, his voice raspy yet steady. "I was just a soldier doing his duty, but when I tried to uphold justice, they erased me. They made me disappear. They turned me into no one." He paused. His sharp eyes moved across the sea of faces before him. "But today I stand before you, and I know at last that the truth has won." A silence fell over the crowd. Then, like a dam breaking, the moment erupted. Journalists surged forward, shouting questions. Cameras flashed wildly, trying to capture the historic moment. But David Cole didn't answer any of them. He simply turned away, stepping back from the podium, because his presence alone was enough. For the first time in decades, he was no longer a shadow. He was a man with a name. The sitting president signed a special executive order, officially restoring David Cole's honor. A formal ceremony was held at the Secret Service headquarters. On the Wall of Honor, where the names of those who had dedicated their lives to the agency were inscribed, a new name was added. David Cole, Shadow 1. As the final letters were engraved into the polished stone, a quiet ripple passed through the gathered agents. Some clapped. Some stood silently, but in their expressions, there was no doubt. This was a moment of long overdue justice. From the back of the hall, Trump stood with his arms crossed, watching the name solidify into history. It was done. But he wasn't finished yet. 1 month later, a new foundation was launched, the David Cole Scholarship Fund, dedicated to supporting the families of fallen and forgotten agents. Those who had given everything for their country yet had received nothing in return, now had a legacy to stand behind. The story of David Cole spread across America. Millions shared the tale of the man erased from history, the man who was finally remembered. Final message. Call to action. Deep in the heart of the forest, inside a secluded cabin, David Cole stood by the window, golden sunlight filtering through the glass. His face was older, lined with time, with hardship, but at this moment, for the first time in 40 years, there was something new in his expression. Relief. He turned to Trump and spoke only one sentence. "Thank you. Not for the honor, but for remembering me." Trump nodded. "Men like you should never be forgotten." And that is how a forgotten hero, after 4 decades, was finally recognized. Now, the choice is yours. Do you believe justice still exists? Do you believe those who sacrifice in silence deserve to be remembered? If you think this story was worth telling, comment 1. If you think it could be told even better, comment 2. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss another story. Thank you for watching. Stay with us for more powerful stories to come.